Hello, guys.
Ah, Dimitri. Dude, your reading on the appearance section was hot. I really like that. You got a great reading voice.
Thanks a lot. I don't believe so,
No,
but
I know so. I know so. And Javier, dude, the violence of thought was hot. And no, the point you were making about you have to think about sublation in nature. It's this topic actually of how thinking, like thought is in the way of the thing you're thinking about. Like you take that seriously, that's a really big deal. Like having to realize that when you think about something, it structures the thing in a manner that is not how you're trying to understand it, which of course makes me think of the movement from understanding to reason. So I really liked what you were saying in your video.
It was crazy because I just had that random epiphany. It's just like, oh, that doesn't. I was like, wait a second. I was like, sublimation actually makes sense. Not when you think about it, but like when you try to see it.
Oh, absolutely. No, the whole idea. And Hal, what a treat. Good to see you, sir. Thanks for stepping in. And no, this problem of like, for example, the idea of a cat is never the cat. Like, there's a lot of the symbiotic people that will talk about like water is not wet. You know, Alfred Korbowski. Actually, Korbowski is one of my favorites. He's a wonderful thinker. He had this lovely experiment in a class where he had this bag and it said dog biscuits on it, and all the students were there. And he took a bag and started eating it, and everyone in the class started throwing up and different things. And then he ripped it off and it said cookies. And he's like, right there, I showed you that words actually matter, that they structure reality. And the point that he was getting at is that words do structure reality. If the bag says dog treats and someone starts eating it, you're like, oh my gosh, that's disgusting. And it turns out it's just a bag of cookies. So there's this weird thing where thought itself does structure reality. And yet to get at what so much Hegel's talking about are a lot of good truths, you actually have to work through the way that thought really does structure reality. And I'm actually very interested in this question of in what way is the word water real? And in what way is the word water not real? In what way is the word sublation like real? It affects the phenomenon itself. And in what ways doesn't it? And I find that a really weird thing. So when all the students are kind of throwing up because they think Korbowski is eating actual dog food, you know, is that an illusion? Well, they experience it as very real, right? It's not really an illusion except retrospectively, right? At the time, it is incredibly real. So the question of in what way is a concept real? How do we work through a concept or thinking to get to the thing itself? All of that I find really fascinating. And I do think it's important in Hegel to note so much of his philosophy is coming from a observation or a study of nature, history, and how these things unfold. And it's so hard because the moment you're talking about a concept, you're talking about a concept. So how do you not fall into the one-sidedness of understanding as opposed to reason? I think these are all massive challenges.
So my immediate thoughts, because I have been reading some of Lacan on anxiety seminar. I'd be curious to apply the objet to, well, I just that's the part where he calls anxiety being where it's the stripping of the supporting of the lack. Like it strips the support of the lack. So if we're going back to that example of the cookies, it's like that word, dog treat, that supports the very structure for us to understand dog treat as a kind of reality, right? But then when somebody attested to that, then you can see how uh, it's almost like anxiety inducing already, just because like you think it's dog treats, like this guy's eating dog treats. There's no there's no possibility of lack here, um, and it's not until the professor goes, "Hey, these are just cookies, not dog treats," um, that you start seeing some of the difference. But yeah, I'd be curious what you think about that.
Well, that's a very interesting example in Sanduni. Good to see you, my dear. I hope you are well. Because in a way, you are lacking the truth, if you grant me that phrase, that they're actually cookies, right? So that entire experience of the class with Professor Korbowski is all necessitated upon the not looking on, per se, the looking at what's actually there, right? And so that is what's lacking. And instead, what has happened is everyone is operating within a symbolic structure of this bag is actually cookies. And what's lacking is the fact that they are they are cookies, not dog treats, I mean. So the symbolic is that they are dog treats. The truth is that they're cookies. Well, people are lacking that truth, if you will, right? And it's interesting because if you take the looking on in Hegel, like you've been emphasizing, there's this notion of you have to, like, you can never do philosophy or think philosophy if you forget the real world, right? If you forget the actual world, because otherwise you're always just dealing in the symbolic, right? You're never dealing with the real. So there's something here where the test is life itself, like we were saying in our talk the other day. And Chetan, good to see you, my friend, and I'll pass it to Dimitri. Like, we always have to remember philosophy is about the world. Like, a true philosophy should be something that anyone can experience for themselves, right? Like, if you were to go out into the world, you would experience it. But it's hard to remember that because you think you're just reading philosophy. But there's always this quote unquote third thing, right? There's always this third thing outside the philosophical discussion of which is the world against which you can think it, right? And that's always what you got to remember. Like Hegel, when he says like looking on, you know, he's like, hey, if you don't have to read Hegel to be a Hegelian, just look on. You know, if you actually just study the world, you know, you'll get it. And that's so what's so funny is that philosophy is about like basically making claims. And yes, Sanduni, the internet glitches are quite amusing, I'm sure. So do enjoy them. But it's always like, if a philosophy is true, you could test it against the real world, right? But then, of course, the problem is in that symbolic structure with the dog treats and the cookie, you're lacking the real world. And what if theoretically Korbowski never unveiled that they were actually cookies, right? Like, what if he never took off and you always thought it was dog treats? You know, that's kind of the weird thing when it comes to life. When we try to test philosophy, there's no guarantee that the professor is going to rip off the label to show that it's cookies instead of dog treats, right? There's no guarantee that God's going to go like open up the sky and he'd be like, yep, you're right. That one is right. Hegel was right. Hey, Hume's right. There's no like words in the sky to unveil. So there's this denial. There's this possible denial of ever the confirmation of the case where you're always stuck in the symbolic. And yet to determine what philosophy is true or not, you need that real, right? And so then the question is, how best can you approach it, and what is the real even constitute, or different things? It's interesting, but let me give it to Mr. Dimitri. I hope I'm not glitching as bad now. Dimitri, good to see you. And again, Chetan, if you didn't, it's good to see you, my friend. And I hopefully can give Sanduni more funny internet glitch faces. But Dimitri, please.
Yes. Yes. So in terms of the real, the real is a very difficult concept, you know, in Lacan. And it's not an either or thing. The real, if there's anything that's not one-sided, it's the real. Because the real is an obstacle to the explanation of the real itself. That is what the real is, positively. But it absolutely resists symbolization, according to Lacan. So it's not that, what I just said. It's not that also. Otherwise, I would be one-sided. So what the hell is the real? Well, it's not outside the image. It's not outside of the symbolic order. It's within that very image itself. Like, imagine a beautiful body, you know, and the real for Lacan and Zizek and all the guys, it's not when you realize that, oh, actually that fantasy I have of that body, that me being sucked into like the beauty of that body, it's not like breaking from that you encounter the real as it is. No, it's within that image, within like being perhaps like hypnotized by the beauty of a body or an image or like a painting. Therein we can find the real. So I think this really should be affirmed, you know, like the symbolic and the imaginary are not positive entities. There is some Lacanians actually who I think have some kind of Kantian understanding of the real, since Lacan said, yeah, it's that which absolutely resists symbolization. But I don't think it's reducible to that, and that also lends to its contradictory status. So I was reading some Zizek today, and then I found him talking about René Girard. And that was very nice. So he says that, you know, there is this idea of this story of like, imagine that you're in a tribe and you ask them, oh, do you guys still have cannibals, you know? And then they say, there are no cannibals in our tribe because we ate the last one yesterday. And this is kind of what Gerard is getting at, Zizek tells us, with the sacrifice in Christ's crucifixion. And he doesn't actually critique Gerard or anything. He kind of just kind of affirms what Gerard is saying, which I thought was very, very interesting. Now, Daniel, I really liked what you recently published on your YouTube account, this series of talks on the philosophy of right and the state of nature. That was really good. But I think when we are thinking about nature and the relationship between nature and notion or state and spirit, things like that, we should really take into account the notion of the Lacanian big other, and is nature some kind of big other, right? Or like I think we talked about it before in the net, like the question shouldn't be like what are we to nature, but what is nature to us? This would be to reverse that kind of substantiality that we think nature might have. And this is also this is an important topic because it's very easy to substantialize nature, but definitely in a sensuous manner.
Excellent comment. I think what you're getting at is, well, what's very interesting is there a Lacanian real if there's not a symbolic and an imaginary, or do you need all three at the same time? Like, do puppies have real? Like at what level of consciousness or of the subject do you get all three? Can you separate them all together? Likewise, the moment we talk about nature, it's arguably not the same kind of nature as, say, a million years ago or something like that, right? There's something that changes in quality of what we refer to when we refer to nature. In the same way that it's almost like, if we go back to that Korbowski example of taking the label off and finding out that it's actually dog treat, is it something where you go through history and at one point you think it's dog treat, and then the label comes off and it turns out nature and notion are two sides of the same coin, and different things like that. So it's a curious question because you kind of have this idea, like, we know in Quentin and After Finitude, we have ancestral fossils, right? And that's what you're saying. So we do know there's a reality independent of consciousness, right? Because you have fossils where there wasn't any consciousness, therefore, and so on. That's true. But what if with the emergence of consciousness, what constitutes the world changes in that Rudolf Steiner, Owen Barfield sort of way, right? So there's a way in which nature now means something different, perhaps, than what nature meant during the dinosaurs, unless there's caves. Let's go even further back, 10 billion years ago or something, right? In the same way that maybe the real today means something different than the real back then. And what's the nature of that real back then? It's kind of curious. No, it is very different. No, it's really difficult because in Hegel, nature and notion become like two sides of the same coin, right? So like there's this really weird, it's actually Javier's problem. The moment we talk about nature, the moment we talk about sublation as an idea, it's independent of its unfolding in actuality. And so the concept strikes the mind differently. Likewise, the moment I talk about nature, it's almost impossible to naturally use that word and remember the construct that Hegel situates it in, right? So you're always falling back, and that's the whole dilemma of these kind of conversations, is like you're always falling back into those different things. So it's a very fair point. Let me pass it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Javier Rivera.
So in the question to the real, I mean, Dimitri brings some good points because it's like, actually in my class later today, we have to debate about like, is atheism natural? And I have the same questions about what do we mean by nature and natural and everything. But it, it would seem like, at least this is the impression I got when Dimitri was talking about the real. It's like, it's hard to talk about it because you're standing in it. Like, it's hard to even like say what it is. Like, and I keep thinking my imagery immediately goes to this idea of like, you've been stuck in a car all your life, but you've never been able to get out of the car to understand how the car looks like, how the car actually functions. You only understand the car from inside the car. And so in that sense, you can never really say exactly what it is, because for you to say it's a car, you'd have to get outside of it, So you're in this thing, and you've just been in there all your life. And yet there seems to be some historical process of everybody being inside that thing. So immediately I start thinking about how there must be some history to the real if we're talking about why there's something that always changes, especially if you're talking about nature always being different in terms of its context. But those are my immediate ideas and thoughts.
I think that's wonderful. Actually, Mr. Luba, good to see you, my friend. And no, the car example is great because in the paper on absolute knowing, it's this question. It actually uses just that example. Like if you're locked in a car, what kind of positive knowledge can you make about the outside world? Well, that's where you sort of say, oh, the car moves. Therefore, what's outside the car must be something that lets the car move. So likewise, if I can never reach the thing of itself, but I know I'm experiencing color, then I can say, okay, well, consciousness is something that can experience something that it thinks is color, right? You start like deducing what is the nature of the knowledge that you can gain about the outside world while you're stuck in a car, right? And that seems to be where the noumenon is for consciousness, like the Hegel move, right? Where it's like, no, okay, Kant, but that's the noumenon is for consciousness to structure, to get real knowledge. It's just it's bracketed. So likewise, the question becomes like, what is it that when we talk about the real, can we gain positive knowledge about the real, even if ultimately it's kind of virtual? There's always that fun idea that there is no big other, right? Well, we can say the real, it's all about anxiety, right? Like the true emotion of anxiety, right? Like we feel there is some sort of experience that is different from fear, because anxiety and fear are not the same, that it turns out the subject is an entity that is trying to avoid something. All right. So if we were to even like kind of bracket out the language of the real and instead just kind of focus on what is the way we carry ourselves in the world, where we're trying to avoid something we know is there, but we want to pretend like we don't know it's there, or we don't want to know it's fully there because maybe it's something out of a Lovecraft story. I actually think Lovecraft is quite useful for thinking these kind of dynamics and different things. So what do we see? Well, whatever this real is, it is something that the human believes encountering would be destructive, right? This real is something that does not easily give itself over to yourself. Like, unless there are other people, like it's only something that seems to emerge with other people around, right? Because they can say something that you don't want to hear and then you're forced to respond to, right? Whereas a tree can't say something that you're forced to respond to, it can only stand there. So there's something about other people that bring it forth. It has something to do with the navigation around other people, the navigation of how other people see you, and all of these different things start coming together. And then maybe that gets into nature, because then the merging of nature and notion gets into treating it like Heideggerian standing reserve, or treating like a thing for itself as opposed to wine that can disclose itself. So there are different questions like that come to mind, but let me pass it to Chetan. Chetan, I hope you are doing well, sir.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. Just something that comes to my mind coming from Dimitri's, very interesting comments. If you think about this question of big other essentially, one way to think about it is, the very idea of two ego consciousnesses coming together actually has a friction within it. It's something like, when you're playing a game, say when you're playing a soccer game or basketball game, it's almost as if without this referee, the basketball game is not possible. There is some other which needs to interpret the rules for them to be applied upon, such that that game becomes possible. And at some point, you need this escape into the big other who will decide the last resort in that sense, the last point of conflict, isn't it? And I think essentially that becomes the background in which it is, in my understanding, big other takes shape in some senses. That is because it's a very interesting idea, because there is no big other. Eventually, you have to do that thing yourself. There is no ground on which you can fall back upon. And yet, human beings almost always need this escape to big other to mediate their own, in some senses, games and conflicts and so on and so forth. It is in this context, nature becomes an extremely interesting idea. In psychoanalysis, we have these kind of thinking where we immediately say, nature is already always cultural. What it means is that there is no absolute nature out there which is completely outside the, which can completely mediate or give the absolute background in which something can be judged and understood and analyzed. And I think this is where the question of real comes into picture. With that there is a friction that always hounds the nature from within itself. Yet I don't think nature as an idea has completely done its course in that sense. Sometimes when we discuss these kinds of things, we also get into this kind of thinking around it, that nature as an idea or as a word has completely become vacuous, and maybe we may let go of the word. I think it has still a lot of meaning left, a lot of juice left. It will keep on coming back in one form or the other. And what is interesting is to see that what forms of thinking nature as a word is going to take for us as a society, and this is my anthropologist in me talking in some senses. I'm interested to see that given the situation we are entering into, where technology is almost always reaching a space first before we are entering it in some senses. We almost always know that there is nothing left in the background anymore for us. But wherever we will enter, we are able to make that environment our own in some senses, make it artificial, make it, within that context, what kinds of meanings and shapes this word nature is going to take is something interesting in my head. I'm not sure how it,
That's a marvelous comment. Let me give it to Mr. Luber here. It makes me think of, Michelle had a wonderful talk, and I'm sorry the cell phone data is so terrible, with Daniel Zaruba on the sociology of space, and where if you live in a city, the very fact that you're constantly surrounded by things that are built transforms how you think, versus if you live in the country where the very space changes things. So I would posit that the word nature, for one, means something different to me than, say, someone who lives in New York, right? And how that, nature to me is something that can destroy your pipes, or it's freezing outside. Nature is something trying to kill you. Javier once had, I remember you once had a talk commenting on Zizek, where the kind of Rousseauian nature is so wonderful and beautiful. And it's like, yeah, that's true. But it's also trying to kill you. It's going to kill you. And it's alive. That's the other thing that's so interesting about nature. It is something that is alive and doing things regardless what you do. The plants are growing, trees are falling, wind is blowing, and it's independent of you. And it's interesting to think of, is Lacan's real alive in the way that nature is alive? Is there a difference between the real of nature and the real of a subject? And obviously there are differences, but then what are those? And is there something about, I sometimes think living in nature, like on a farm, actually helps you not lose sight of Lacan's the real. Because there's this thing that can destroy your pipes. There's this thing that could blow your house over. There's this reality that can come crashing in at any moment. And I wonder if there's an indirect habituation of one to the other because you're used to that unknown. But let me give it to Mr. Luber and then to Dimitri. Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir. Your book rocks. It's really, really impressive. So well done.
Thank you. I can't wait to get into it with you and try to make it as best as possible. But yeah, Chetan, you were just saying some really interesting things that made me think about, I just watched recently the Lex Fridman podcast with the CEO of the ChatGPT guy. And what he said, something that made me realize something that Heidegger said so long ago about how we're not actually the ones in control in that play here, in terms of how we necessarily create and define our positionality. It's the same thing with technology, and it's just becoming very clear in terms of how ChatGPT went from ChatGPT version 1, then it went to ChatGPT version 2 and 3, and all they would do in these updates was just add in more information to these language models. They don't know why ChatGPT 3 is working. They themselves don't even understand what made ChatGPT 3 better than ChatGPT 2, besides providing more information. They don't know at what point did the information satisfy the learning machine giving satisfactory responses. So that is pretty scary when you think about that, because you actually don't know what is moving the cogs here. It's not actually the information at hand. It's something that beyond, it's that which creates what's at hand, in a sense, and that's not where we're focused at. Just as a human society, we're always focused at kind of what's at hand. So I just thought, it just made me think of that. So I just wanted to comment on that.
No, that's lovely. I'll pass it to Dimitri and then Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, good to see you, sir. We've lost Javier. His video on sublation and the tyranny and the violence of thought was really good. I enjoyed that. And it is interesting because, again, when you live in nature, like on a farm, like your pipes can freeze, the cold comes up. There's always this unknown that can force itself upon you, and that's not in your control. And it's interesting to think of that and compare it to Lacan's The Real, but also to think of that and compare it to AI doing things that we can't control. It's interesting that humans have created something that's almost, they're talking about it now like a force of nature. That it's something that is acting and you've got to like learn how to live with, even if you don't know exactly how it operates and how do you respond to that. And it's interesting, those kind of overlaps there.
Daniel, can I just jump in real quick
please.
and say that it's ironic that just like we don't know exactly why ChatGPT 3 is working in the way that it's working, like why it's like satisfying the conditions for what we need for it to be considered AI at the moment, is the same thing that applies to us with thinking. Like we actually don't know what is causing our next thought. Like we're not in control of our next thought. Like our next thought it kind of comes to you, and then what you're in control more so is the response to the thought. And it's the same thing with the ChatGPT. It's like we don't actually know what's providing the actual thought of what ChatGPT's outputs, in other words, like the output of ChatGPT 3, but we just have some like surface level idea of what goes into it, just like for our own thoughts. Like, oh, we have the environment, we have the history that's going into the environment, and that leads into what our next thought could be, but yet it's not actually what these are just factors at play. They're not actually the thing that is causing it, so to speak. But yeah.
No, and that's interesting because, there's a lot of things, as I understand, in the universe or in quote unquote nature, and we don't know fully how it works or how it operates, and yet it still works on us and we have to respond to it. Now, I'm not saying we don't know anything. It's just interesting to see those kind of overlaps that come to the front. And yeah, like you mentioned, the Friedman, I know he also had that interview with the guy saying we're all going to die. It starts with an E and I can't say his name. And then Tyler Cohen, the economist, came back and he's like, look, I'm always skeptical if people say we're all going to die. And it's interesting, that conversation that's going on. And then whatever that guy, Ilan Yuzaka, whatever his name is, because I can't pronounce words, I have friends in that industry who are like, yeah, he's a quack. But maybe they're just saying that because they're in that industry and want him to be a quack, right? So then we all have to deal with the real. Like, what is the real? What is it in that situation? And let me pass it to Dimitri. And Mr. Ebert, before I forget, I wanted to note what you said last week, that the only infinity we should take seriously is within finitude. Like, is that a concept you could throw at mathematics and like blow it all up and like Occam's razor all the theories relying on an infinity out of finitude? Because that sounds pretty freaking revolutionary. So I really liked that because I was thinking how useful that could be as a Occam's razor in different fields, cutting things out. So before I forgot, I wanted to note that. But let me pass it on.
Daniel, we're talking about the real and the relationship between the real and language, right? Now, for Lacan and Zizek, the real is an effect of language. The subject is an effect of language. And this also gets to the real status of jouissance. Since on the one hand, it seems like we have lost jouissance. There's this sense of loss, of some kind of full jouissance, like the intuitive oneness. But at the same time, this jouissance haunts us. And this is like, I would also say, the real status of the compulsion to repeat. Because in that very loss of jouissance, we postulate the return to that jouissance, which exerts some kind of surplus of it. And this is kind of returning again and again. It's kind of a problem in that sense, that we cannot get rid of it. So the problem is not like how do we deal, like that's what I would say. It's not that we live our lives and then the real comes in. No, we constantly live with the real as this compulsion to repeat. Now here it would be interesting to think about the Platonic Hegelian notion of recollection. And I'm curious as to what would be your thoughts on Hegel's notion of recollection, and especially the way he uses it in the Science of Logic, because there it seems like he's totally Platonic and he's totally about a recollection of the absolute idea, to simplify it to the utmost. It seems like there is Barth talks about it a lot, this idea that birth is a trauma, and then you try to return to this intuitive oneness. Well, you could critique the notion of recollection by saying that that is what it is getting at, right? And Barth critiques Plato all the time for this reason. Now, I think the fact that Hegel actually goes into this notion says a lot about the way he sees it. And I think especially this Barthian notion of the real is that which, is that what occurs when your house is set on fire or there's a tsunami, is especially not what Lacan and Zizek mean when they say the real. And Barth has this, he proclaims himself to be a monist, and there's this implicit dualism that reproduces in his philosophy insofar as he ultimately rejects some very fundamental gestures of our psyche in regards to this intuitive oneness or the notion of recollection, which are not separated, right? They are inseparable, and Hegel even makes use of it. So yeah, I'm curious to your thoughts about that. Oh, just one thing to add, like outright rejecting dualism or monism are both symptomatic of some implicit dualism or monism that is naive and cannot see the inseparability of both. Like, it's nice to make a provocation like Cadell did in his PhD dissertation, and put forth non-monism, which is very contradictory, of course. But apart from that, I don't see the use of that discussion, even though it might be more productive than the discussion on materialism and idealism. But I digress. I'm talking too much.
No, not at all. Not at all. No, and that is actually really funny. Where the split between monism and dualism is of itself kind of a split there that's problematic. Yeah, my friend Pei has been doing a lot of Descartes, and whenever I return to a thinker, I'm always like taken by how our reading of them is so much just kind of handed down popularly. Like, so much of Descartes, like, his goal is not necessarily to create dualism. He's responding to the idea that history developed assuming that the earth was the center of the universe. You had the Copernicus revolution. So what can we know? Like, can we know anything? If we, look, it looks like the sun's going around the earth, and it's not, and mind blown. Where that being his main concern, and then coming up with the possibility of sort of dualism and Cartesianism being secondary to that historic reality, gives you a different framing on those things. So I think it's important. No, with the recollection, I think, again, Cadell has put it quite well. I think Hegel wants to negate sublate Plato, right? And where recollection, what's so interesting is Hegel has said we can't think the future, we have to think the now, we have to think the past. Like, thinking that is not recollecting is not bringing what the notion has gone through history into itself to think now. And certainly, if you don't think that, well, then you're not going to be thinking the now, because part of the now is that gathering up. I always think the word recollect is interesting because it has collection in it, the gathering up, the bringing in, and you have to recollect that. And definitely philosophy that doesn't collect into itself what we've gone through in history to think the now is going to end up being detached, disembodied. It's not going to be connected. It's going to be entering into the realm of that dangerous, as I've called it, auto-cannibalism. That can be quite problematic. Now, of course, we have to risk the auto-cannibalism, as we talked about last time, but we don't want to get lost in, we don't want to realize that that's what we're doing. No, I think, again, to understand, I think Hegel's reading of Plato takes very seriously when Plato refers to forms in terms of orbits of planets, not just perfections, but trajectories according to which things follow. And that has to be thought and taken seriously. So those are some of the initial things that come to mind. And no, I'm not saying that the real is nature. What to me is interesting is that when you live on a farm and you have this reality that a tornado can come up and destroy everything, or you can have the barn, like we had the barn blown over by a storm at one point, like that always can appear, but you also kind of have to live not thinking about that all the time. Like you almost have to be in a symbolic where you pretend that's not a reality, because if you did, you'd be paranoid and crazy of all the things that can go wrong, right? And yet that is something that can always occur. So to me, it's interesting. I just wonder, like living in nature where you're susceptible to those elements almost habituates you to be more attuned to some of the things that Lacan is bringing forth. And also you can't separate the risk of the farm and everything from living there. Like they all come together. So like in Lacan, like you're saying, the moment you have language, these things come together. I feel that it's interesting for me to think that in terms of the farm. So that's what I meant. But let me pass it to Mr. Alexander Ebert. Mr. Ebert, I hope you're well today, sir.
Hello, everybody. This is perfect. I've been writing about exactly this. Dimitri, I'm sure that Lacan contradicts himself later in life, but in Seminar 1, he says, the real is that which resists symbolization.
Yes, I just
absolutely.
mentioned that before you came here.
Well, let me bind both pieces together, the Barthian and the Lacanian, and it all has to do with absence and excess. And it's very simple, and I just keep wanting you and others to really understand that you resist. So we're talking about the subject and the subject's interaction with absence of meaning, absence of symbolization. Anytime we experience an absence of symbolization, an absence of language, we experience the real. But that does not mean that the real is pre-linguistic. What it means is there's an excess of language, usually an excess of symbolization, which exceeds our ability to schematize it, which exceeds our ability to make sense of it. So for instance, if the house is burning, you're suddenly for a moment in a state of intercategorical awe, or it's awful, it's terror, whatever it is, but it's intercategorical. And so for the moment, you're confronted with the real. It's in excess of language, in excess of identification, in excess of schematization, categorization. So it's an intercategorical moment which produces the real. And that's why, you know, what Lacan says jives with what Bard says, because when it's in excess, it resists symbolization. When it's in excess, it goes momentarily absent. And so the two are the same. And what, who was it? What Andrew was mentioning is what I've been writing about a lot with regard to this notion that developers it makes me laugh, no longer understand how AI works. It's just so funny. It's so classic. It's so beautiful. It's a perfect allegory to our own relationship to our unconscious. And again, the reason why they don't understand why AI works is, of course, a subjective limitation that we have due to information in excess of our capacities. If we had increased limitation, we would be able to understand up to a given point, and then we'd have to increase the limitation again. We'd be able to understand how AI is working. But because it's in excess of our capacity, it goes absent. Same with our unconscious. Our unconscious has so much information in it that it's in excess of our capacity to comprehend it in full, in particularity. So again, and then relating this back to the real, that's why the unconscious is an example of the real. That's why AI is an example of the real. These processes, the black box of AI. And that's also why an event that overwhelms you, the Grand Canyon, whatever that is, for the moment. And when you said nature, it depends what kind of nature, right? If it's a blade of grass, it doesn't hit us as the real. It's not overwhelming us. But if we get into a mode and I'm like, oh, this blade of grass, suddenly it's the real. If I allow it to saturate my limitations and overwhelm me, and again, it produces a moment of the real. So that which resists symbolization entirely is not that which always. So the blade of grass is sometimes the real, then it's not the real. You know what I mean? It's a moment of full resistance vis-a-vis excess, and it's all to do with limitations, excess, and those excesses absent momentarily categorization and produce the real or the confrontation with the real. Anyway, I'm very excited y'all are talking about this. This is my shit.
Well, very good, Mr. Ebert. And again, it is very interesting that precisely at a point of excess, it seems like nothing. But this nothing is quite different from the nothing of subtraction. And I think exploring that, again, is quite fruitful. And it should be noted that I feel as if almost in some respects, the clearing in Heidegger, which Mr. Luber is so gone on, the idea in Heidegger is that if you were to make a clearing, the fact that being would come forth would suggest that being is excess, because you don't have to add anything; it just comes forth, right? And so likewise, what's interesting is that it's almost like if human beings can't fully understand AI, the more we get out of the way, the more AI can do its thing, right? So because it has an excess. In the same way that so many of the psychoanalytical ways, like if we think of Freud, like stream of consciousness, Joyce. What is Joyce doing in stream of consciousness, right? He's getting out of his own way and he's just writing like a Faulkner or different things, right? Like that the subconscious is an excess, that if we could just get out of our own way, those things would come forth, right? Likewise, if you could get behind people's, their social positioning, their jobs, their work, and the ways that they hide from themselves, if you get those out of the way, then there's this excess that comes forth that we need to get at to really get what's there and different things. And so it's very interesting to think, what does it mean to get out of the way of excess? In what ways is it good to get out of the way of the excess so the excess can come forth, right? What is it to look at a blade of grace in that in the Walt Whitman way, or the William Blake, a grain of sand is the universe? What is the act of the subject to experience the grain of sand is the universe? It seems to have something to do with getting out of the way, right? It has something to do with getting ourselves out of the way so that the excess of the grain of sand can come forth. Likewise, in Heidegger, there's this clearing so that the being can come forth. And so often we've thought of things about adding. We need to add to make the being come forth. And Heidegger's like, no, that's to reduce it to being with a lowercase b, because it's already there if you just get out of the way, right? And it's interesting in those regards, because then when I think about recollection, like in Hegel, it's like, you don't need to add anything. Like philosophy doesn't need to add future abstract thoughts. What we need to do is gather what has come and get out of the way of what can be disclosed.
I just want to double tap right quick on what you said on the being is excess. Through developing this philosophy, I've been able to meditate in a different way, where I clear the conscious frame to allow, and as soon as I do, I'm aware that what I'm allowing forth into the conscious frame as absence of mind is the excess of my unconscious, which I cannot pick apart in determinate space, but which fills my conscious frame in its totality and thereby renders me absent, aka present, right? Like in the state of being as opposed to becoming. And that understanding that the nothingness of everything, to quote Hegel, as he says it best in Phenomenology of Spirit, is being. And that's the only way to get rid of something. And especially like if we're going to take the first law of thermodynamics, you can't destroy or create energy, then the only way you can make anything disappear is to smear it across the entire universe, to make it evenly distributed, to make it in complete relation with itself, so a plenum where there just is itness, and we know this from day-to-day experience, that this is how things disappear. This is how we end up taking someone for granted. This is how we end up automating our lives, by it being in sort of imminent relation to us. So anyway.
I think Carl Jung talked about consciousness being inherently divisive, and that's what it does, is kind of cuts things up into words and tries to make it comprehensible, and that maybe the getting out of the way is to stop trying to divide it, and that leads back to the original undivided wholeness, and that's like the excess I think you're going to be talking about. And so like we stop trying to call the blade of grass one particular thing, it kind of falls back into the wholeness, like the undivided. I think that's it.
No, thank you, Hal. No, I think bringing in Jung is interesting. That kind of idea that thought divides, therefore thinks, but that very division thus frames the subject of that thought in a way that can actually remove us from us potentially, or keep us from getting to it. But then again, without that, it couldn't be meaningful. It'd be difficult to discuss a blade of grass and to function and so on and so forth. So I appreciate that, Hal. Let me give it to Mr. Luber.
What you and Alex just said, I'm like, I was trying to get my camera working because my mouth is just like dropping. I'm just in such a deep thought because to me this is all very related to like storyteller, and just I've been thinking a lot about just investigating the unconscious through theme and just like how that would go. And something just clicked when, I mean, I've been thinking about everything and nothing basically for months since Ebert gave that like intro. I forget which net it was, like 2 or 3 or something like that. And just the whole concept of when you're tripping, that language is present. It's just so mushed out at that moment that you can't actually like see it as like your typical colloquial worldview, lens, language, whatever. I think when I was thinking about this at a pregame this past weekend, where everyone's at this like social gathering, and I'm thinking of lack, and I'm thinking of how that might be like a good starting point into thinking about how to take a step back and therefore gain something that we're actually trying to get instead of adding, like you were talking about, Daniel. Like everyone's at the social gathering, I could say everyone's lacking like some social relation, hence why they're there. I feel like there's that like assumption that immediately goes on with when you think about lack, and then those assumptions of like why you think everyone has these lacks, then you can kind of like look back at yourself and be like, okay, why am I now thinking that these are the lacks of these situations? What is it saying about myself? And then kind of going through your own like go through your own thinking in terms of why these lacks are like the most readily available lacks that you choose to like use in your head, basically. And then kind of when you think about why that being your like that being your lack, you look at your frame that you're in, and you try to say to yourself, what could be alternative lacks that you just haven't suggested yet? And I think at that point is when you start actually investigating your unconscious, because at that point you're really just telling stories. You're really just coming up with far-fetched things and you're trying to rope it into like it being the shared lack in the situation. So like once you kind of bracket off the initial lacks that you think are what's creating the shared lack, so to speak, once you bracket that off, you have to kind of use your like be imaginal, start imagining other possible lacks that weren't given, essentially given lacks. And at that point, I think that's when you can start kind of thinking about your unconscious and potentially different ways of looking at situations, which could lead to expansions of language, because you realize that the language that you're already situated in might not be the only shared language, so to speak, that's bringing everybody together. And that's when you could possibly look at, to tie it back into the tripping thing, it's like you can look at your trip and you can kind of not understand the language in a better way, but understand your positionality to the expansion of language in a more cohesive way.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. And I think bringing it into the question of story, especially in your book, when you connect that story is going to be participating in a theme, and theme is relative to a thema, where you have, and then thema, I think you could even bring together where Hal brought up Jung and archetypes and different things. Those things can kind of go together. And there's a way in which the theme is in excess of the story, and yet the story requires the theme to not just be a plot, but the theme also requires a thema, which is an excess of the theme, to be a theme that's situated in something bigger. Like you make the example in the book, and you do this with, you could do with the Mahabharata or anything. You know, if we were to take let's do the Mahabharata, and you have the Bhagavad Gita in the middle of it, and the Mahabharata is a giant thema. It's going to have many structures, but then the theme of the particular exchange between Arjuna and Krishna on the question of, do you follow your dharma or do you follow your karma? Do you go against your family? Do you go against your duty? And then the story being about how those things all gone. And the reason this story lasts for so long is precisely because it's operating on all those levels at the same time. There are 3 levels that are each in excess of one another, right? And there you would making the example where many stories tend to die out, like you were talking about with Cameron and Avatar, where there's some stuff in there that's pretty and really neat and audiences want to see it. But since the experience of the scene of people flying does not have anything in excess of that scene beyond just the neatness of it, it probably won't last through time, right? Because audiences change through time, right? So an audience that finds the technology of Avatar 2 really cool today, in 50 years may not find it that cool, right? And so as a result, the story can fail. Whereas something that's able to operate on all 3 of those levels can keep going. And so that changes things. And my internet may have dropped. I cannot tell.
Everything, that was great. Thank you for
it froze up because of the internet. You know, when we get to April, we get a lot of haze on the mountains, and when that occurs for about 3 weeks, it's a disaster. But you know, I'm really, really hopeful. But it's interesting, like when you make the example, like you make the example of Pulp Fiction, where the story, there's an excess of the story in the theme, and the theme is in excess to something larger, and that's a better long-term strategy. Therefore, it seems like it can last. Whereas if there's nothing in the construction of the story that is in excess to the present now, beyond just the mere entertainment, it doesn't seem like it's going to last. It has to be touching on something larger, which, you know, you could get into the language of archetypes. You can get into the language of these bigger things. And, you know, you made the example. But what were you going to say, Mr. Luber?
What's interesting is when you think about stuff in terms of story, and you think in terms of lack, though, and you're trying to determine the shared lack in the situation, whatever becomes like phenomenologically present as the shared lack is only part of the unfolding of your story. Yes. So there's something that you're aware there's something concealed within that reveal.
Yes.
And because there's something that's concealed within that reveal, you can then re-question the shared lack again and try to get a different answer, and then the same thing happens. You then understand that it's part of an unfolding of your phenomenological experience. So then it's like almost like you're progressing what's happening based off of you realizing that there's an unfolding of a shared lack. So that is like how I think, to me right now, the only way you can tackle like the access or the subconscious is just having you constantly bring kind of what Ebert was saying, what comes present into your frame.
No, I mean, what you're saying, it's just funny, like kind of to your point, the moment you talk about excess, the talking about the excess is not the excess, right? And yet you have to talk about it to get at the excess. And that's always it's the Heideggerian move, right? Where the revealing is always hiding at the same time. So there's a lot there.
Exactly.
Let me pass it to Chichan. Chichan.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I can add to the discussion. Ebert's comments are brilliant in that sense, but you should try and flap sometimes. So, one of the things, at least I think, in the discussion of the real is that I think we lose sight of a distinction between -1 and 0. One is an idea of lack that comes from this, that something is missing, simply in that sense, and that is the point of 0 that we then think about, and we construct a theoretical sort of insights from that ground. What we miss is that Lacan is not doing that. Lacanian thinking actually starts from -1. There is a form of unity at stake in that lack. which is how these questions of excess, as Ebert brilliantly put it, comes at stake, and we need to start thinking differently from, let's say, Kant in that sense. That fundamental non-relation that we discuss actually hides within itself not simply a lowest zero in that sense, oh, there is no relation. It is a question of non-relation. Non is a different from no. That distinction has to be understood. That non-relation means that you have to you can always struggle through a relationship through that because there is there's a minimum -1 that already sort of structures that space, which is why you get these kind of constructions that real is a twist, in the fabric of the being, and those kinds of thinkings sort of emerge, that it's a fiction, it's a form of resistance, all of those. That language comes because it is what hounds the representation from within itself in some senses. Now, that is, I think, one sort of side to it. And me and Daniel had a long discussion once about thinking of this problem through Gödel. Gödel's incompleteness theorem essentially enters a similar kind of so if you look at Gödel's incompleteness theorem, he's not saying that there are questions that can never be answered. That's not his claim. If that would have been a claim, that's a simpler claim of certain questions that cannot be answered. There's a zero over there. There are questions. He's saying that in a particular system, there would always be a question that cannot be answered from within the system. That means the question can be answered. That's not a problem. As Ebert also said, if you have more information, you have more capacity, you can understand what the AI is doing, but there's something else you'll not be able to understand. That there is always a limitation about not that a question itself can never be answered, but from within the system, within the context, there would be at least one question that cannot be answered within that system. That is the point of resistance and it is through that gap thinking occurs in some senses. It is through that background, a very fundamental background from which your ability to think, your ability to symbolize actually emerges. This relationship in real, imaginary, and symbolic actually, structures itself within that background, that thinking requires itself to work against that minimal, excess, which sort of structures itself through a certain -1, certain lack, such that something like, symbolization or representation becomes possible for us.
No, I think that's excellent. So if I were to call, I like to call that point the Gödel point, where you have to make the choice between coherence or correspondence, right? It's interesting to think that in the system, it's a quote unquote lack, but whatever the thing outside the system is an excess, right? That's what's kind of weird. Precisely at the Gödel point, you see this weird coming together, right? And there's a question of, is -1, is that excess of 0, or is that a lack from 0, right? Because the word negative, now we know on a plane, negative is just directionality, right? So there's something about, when we talk about the -1 in Lacan, what direction are we going toward? We going toward the subject? We going toward the world? We going toward the subject mixed with world? We going to, what directionality is that going in that is locating the Gödel point, right? Is the Gödel point between me and the world? Is the Gödel point located in the mixture of me and the world? Is the Gödel point located in me to me? Is it in all of those at the same time? Because then you get into the question of where the lack and the excess together come from, what causes it, and what is it? Now, that's a very strange question. I don't have answers. I'm wondering now, kind of what Hal was saying also with the archetype, making me think, Young, to be really, really strange, if you were to somehow be able to process through AI the entire subconscious mind of a human being, would you find, first off, I wonder if archetypes would arise that we didn't know about. There's that creepy woman that's poisoning all the pictures, Lobo or whatever, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's archetypes coming out in the AI or whatever. But there's also if you were to somehow process, and I don't even know if this question makes sense, it might be asking if you can have a square circle or something. But if you were to somehow use AI to process the subconscious, would you find a Gödel point? Would there be a point eventually where the AI is no, there's some sort of excess that we can't reach, or would it actually somehow completely process it or determine all, and you'd find that there is no lack or excess, right? That's interesting because if it was theoretically possible to process the whole subconscious, but you still located a lack or a Gödel point, then you could start to suggest where the Gödel point is located. Is it in the subject to the subject? Is it in the mixture, in the between space between subject and world? Is it in the relations between people? That's interesting. And the other thing I was curious about, and then I'll give it to Mr. Luber, is what is the difference, if you grant me this language, between, say, the excess of the experience of a Lovecraft creature, where you're reduced to ass, and the excess experience of a beatific vision or a psychedelic trip? Are there differences? I know, Mr. Ebert, you've made points where they kind of come together like the drunkard and the sage, right? You know, they're like the wise man and the drunkard, they look the same, but internally there's a difference. There's something interesting between, is there a difference in the experience of a Lovecraft creature versus a psychedelic trip internally? If so, that may start to suggest differences between the character of excess and lack in one versus the other, and different things. So I'm thinking about all of that, but let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
I think Wolfgang Smith has a lot of these answers. I forget which book he wrote. It was something he put out in the 90s, like Quantum Enigma. Basically, I think the implications of what he's talking about is simply that he's very platonic. So just like just being the eternal observer, that is the position. So just basically that you're essentially 1 foot in the feedback loop, while 1 foot being aware that it's only 1 foot of you is in the feedback loop. Because I mean, you could get to that in so many ways. Maybe I'm not understanding the question as much, but does that seem to be an answer? Just basically having 1 foot in, 1 foot out?
Well, I can't say that I fully understand the question because I'm exploring it, but yes, I think Wolfgang Smith, vertical causality, that is an interesting thing to incorporate. But the question is, like, where would you locate it? Like, is this excess and lack subject to subject? Is it in the like the between space of world and subject? Do you find it in the world to itself? Like all of those, and is AI, like, could AI process the subconscious and find a Gödel point?
Like, I think basically with the AI question, like, I think Wolfgang would just simply say, we wouldn't, from our position, we wouldn't be able to even understand that the AI is hidden access. So from the AI's position, they are infinitely access to us. Like, we wouldn't be able to comprehend their access. I feel like it's completely theoretical, but it does make sense because for us, like, vertical causation and the lack are very much talking about the same thing, where they're talking about something that's instantaneously causal, like the very perception of either your mind perceiving a situation in terms of a lack, that's instantaneous. Like, it's not something that you have to break down the situation per se to like get to. It's just there. It's what actually draws the situation to be the situation. Where vertical causation, he's just talking about more in like in the moment when you look at something, how you instantaneously can understand it as something. And that force is just a sign that we are partially with the eternal cosmos, and that we're also part of our own like phenomenological, our own existential. Like, we have our own existential that's not our own. That's so the location point is just would be in, for him, vertical causation. Like that, the point of Godel, I can't say his name, but the question at hand, the point of recognizing how that instantaneous perception can occur is that like golden place, because that place is just, again, you in and watching the feedback loop.
No, I mean, like, you just look at the sky and you know it's the sky. Like, you don't have, what do they call it? A zero proof or something in computer science where you can just apprehend and you get it or whatever, a zero evidence proof. Like, I can just look at the sky and note it. Nobody has to prove it to me. And there's a way in which that is the Gödel point, like the ability to just, boom, apprehend and know. It's just there. How are you able to do that? Like, how do you get that? I know you have to teach children in different degrees, but then of course there are all the then that gets into child psychology and different things like that. So that kind of apprehension is quite curious and quite relevant. But let me pass it to Chetan and then Mr. Ebert.
So just sort of continuing from Daniel's sort of point there. I think there's a very interesting joke which Zizek sort of starts in a very his book on violence actually. I think he tells the jokes through wheelbarrows. I don't know jokes from that, but I know it's from donkeys in that sense that this idea that a man was smuggling something and he used to go on a donkey and come back and a person used to stop him, check him, and and he realized that he had nothing. And these days used to happen. One day he became rich. This policeman came to his house and he asked, "Okay, you can tell me now, what were you smuggling? How did you become so rich?" He said, "I was smuggling donkeys." Real is something of that structure in that sense that it is exactly that thing that you don't take into account. I think Zupančič has a very brilliant sort of analysis for this. When Zupančič sort of in her book sort of thinks about this question of real in the context of sexuality, she's arguing that if real was simply, and this is I think that there is a bad way to interpret that Lacanian dictum that real is what escapes the civilization in that sense. That if real was simply that escapes, there wouldn't have been a problem. We could have just gained pleasure from partial drives from here and there, and it would have been all good. In that story, if it's simply something outside, it is on the outside. It should not trouble us. Whatever pleasure we can get from it, we can, and that also does become an ideological sort of thinking in our. The problem of real exactly is that no matter where we try and locate ourselves, that's the question that you were trying to ask. What is the location of real in that sense? No matter where the subject tries and locate itself, real emerges as a twist within that matrix in that sense. There is no complete position possible from which you can find, a certain equidistance from the real in that manner. It is the donkey which which is being smuggled every time, which escapes that. And that the challenge is to remain with this idea without making it go slip into this idea of a lack which is zero in that sense. That's the challenge that real poses to us in our ability to think it. I guess I'm not sure. Yeah, Ebert. Yeah, please go ahead.
I love this. I was just going to add that, like, a good thought experiment is something I've been thinking about. If you were like a Superman who had quantum vision, quantum hearing, like infinitely capable, no limitations, and that's all that you could see. You didn't have the ability to tone it back. You just saw everything. Every fucking atom, every quantum bit, all the quantum superpositioning. What would it look like when water turned to steam? Would it even look like water to begin with? And then would there be a difference between the water and the steam? Would you even be able to tell the difference between the water and the stove? Or the water and the air, and all the virtual particles popping in and out of existence around the water? Our limitations this is the most mind-blowing aspect of this, and I don't know if it's true, but I know that we may never not know if it's true because we're stuck in our subjectivities. And that is that everything that we take to be manifest is a result of our limitations to see otherwise, to see beyond the thing as more than the thing. If we dialed up our abilities and increased our limitations infinitely, I wouldn't, and that was all I could do, is just see everything. I don't think I could make sense of anything, right? It would all just be sort of everything. And so I would be able to make sense of nothing. And so I'd be existing in this state of sort of nothingness. And so I think about that with regard to boiling water turning to steam, because it's such a tried and true aspect of phase shifting. It's one of the grand metaphors of water does this and then it does that. But in reality, it's possible that we're doing that. Not that we're making it boil, but that we're overlaying our limitations upon a process that we are then able to characterize ontologically. And that's how water turns to steam, because we can't see it do anything else. And that's a pretty mind-blowing talk about, that idea of like including the subject radically in everything we do, including science. I think that is going to be the sort of, I just think the way out is through, and that a lot of the questions of science and the, collapsing classical into quantum and all of these things are going to have to like radically deal with consciousness and limitation. So anyway, I would just, you guys were bringing in nature a bunch, so I thought I'd just bring it to that. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Well, let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber, what he's speaking about finitude makes me think of your work on story and how you need the finitude for theme, story, and theme. But anyway, Mr. Luber.
Yeah, I once again fucking love what you just said. I think that, I think Wolfgang would say, actually, I think as humans, we are in the, let's say, water, not the water and the steam, so to speak. Like we're in like the water itself, and the steam itself, in a sense, is like a condition in itself. And because it's a certain condition in itself, like we are in a human finite condition. So we are like limited to that conditionality, so to speak. I think Wolfgang, what makes us be able to pick up on transitory things, like I like what you said. What Wolfgang would say is, from a when you look at something corporeally, there is no such thing as quantum. There is no such thing as the quantum realm. There's a difference between measurement and perception. Perception is the act of vertical causation, where measurement is the act of horizontal causation. And they're two different fundamental features of the cosmos. And that he would say that if we were that Superman that can see all the quantum stuff, it still doesn't address what we're perceiving. That's only addressing everything that we can measure. So I think the person that would be, because I wrote a short story for like the TV show Daniel Coexist. I wrote a short story about someone, it's called Die Already, about an individual just like that, who's basically Superman God, who has all the quantum abilities and whatnot. And he just couldn't see, he couldn't perceive his reality. So he just had like an existential crisis, essentially. That's what the story is about, and him falling in love and then figuring out a way to kill himself in order to finally get a sense of just perceiving for the first time ever. The point is that I think when you look at an ontological landscape like perception, in the way Wolfgang's talking about, you start looking at how to, I don't want to say measure, but diagnose different ways in which one can perceive, and not different in the sense that like, I'm going to argue with you that I have a phone in my pocket. Like my phone, everyone's going to say it's a phone. Like I'm not trying to say, to argue what people are instantaneously seeing. But if you think about how you're even in a position to see, that is the space. He calls this the intermediary realm, where basically we're all part of this realm where we share a space where there's a possibility of that we can explain why we're perceiving the thing instantly, and there's different ways of attacking how to explain how we're seeing something instantly that's not through measurement. And then that science hasn't really been explored, or that scientific perspective just hasn't been explored. To me, that's like what storytelling is. So like you can just basically give different explanations for why you believe this factual thing that you're seeing.
Well, now you're definitely making me think of science and logic, and story as measurement is quite interesting, where there's something about story that is a form of measurement. There's a few things. So first off, it would seem to me that when we talk about like the real Lacan, it's all like talking about within finitude, right? It's within the structure of finitude. And theoretically, if there was no finite limitation, if we were the Superman who could see everything and so on and so forth, we wouldn't have to worry about the breakdown between the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. The issue, it seems, is like when we talk about the real in Lacan, it seems, the head kind of goes the actual, like what is actually the case. But it's almost like, I guess the way I think about it is if you go to a movie theater and somebody has draped a coat over a seat, right? Like it actually is not correct to take the seat, even though it's kind of arbitrary, right? It's not actually there. There is a reality where you're kind of addicted to take the person's seat. And yet there's no like law in the nature of reality that says you shouldn't sit in a chair that has a coat draped on it, right? And then also it's interesting because the moment you start saying, why exactly do we think it's silly not to sit in a chair that has a coat draped on it? Once you make the implicit explicit, how that can kind of like, you realize, oh, maybe it is just a silly social convention. And then the implicit die. Like there's always that risk of making the implicit explicit that kills it, right? And so likewise, there's always something about bringing the real into the symbolic order that risks destroying the symbolic order. And then you need the symbolic order to operate, because if you couldn't rely on people not sitting in chairs that had coats draped on it, then what could you rely on? And stuff starts breaking down. We make the Superman example, like it's almost like AI. If AI was capable of seeing everything like Superman, or got to the place where it could see things in that way, then could we it's almost like the problem is we're not going to be able to understand the AI, right? Like we would need AI to evaluate AI, right? Because we're stuck in finitude where we can't really understand how it's seeing things. And so then the question is, do you experience AI as totally, this is why I guess I was thinking Lovecraft and Dante, do you experience the AI as totally alien? Like it has nothing to do with your world? Or do you experience it as an excess of your world? Like where it's actually been able to gather everything up in manners that you can't comprehend, and you experience that as an excess or an alien, but then of course it kind of merges together. Then I also wonder in the thought experiment if there would be a difference between somebody who was born always seeing the quantum realm in the way that you were describing, and someone who came to one day be able to see it. Like at 30 years old, you gain that ability, right? Like how would that be different for the subject? And how would you undergo that? Like if you started always outside of finitude in a sense and stayed outside of finitude versus infinitude and then moved to a place where you weren't so bound to finitude, what's the difference in that experience? Would the transition be experienced as a loss or an excess? That's kind of like, would you feel like you lost something now that you can't see water, only quantum? Or would you be like, man, I've gained the truth. Now I can really see what water is. Like, what would the experience be? Which is interesting to me. But please, Mr. Ebert.
Yeah, this question of what I should go out here because Lindsay's on a call. But the question of like, what is the difference of that interior between the stupor and the enlightened? How would we translate? Why would we translate one excess as joyous, or a return to the womb, indeterminacy, and just sort of this amazing sort of wash versus I guess the delineation is awesome versus awful. still awe, still in excess of our ability to schematize and categorize and create sort of, the ontological pinnings. And I don't think, I don't know. I don't have an answer. There may not be an answer, because again, this comes down to each individual subject and also groupings of people, experience the same thing at the same time. You look at the girls in front of the Beatles screaming their heads off, and clearly that's an instance of contagion of excess. So the symbolic has this ability, obviously, to package the real, to package it and place it under the reins of language, behind the bars of language, and to take what is otherwise indeterminate, excess, and make it determinate. But in doing that, and that's why, Dimitri, his comment in the comment section is misguided in terms of his critique of me. The item, the object, contains the indeterminacy, but through language, we objectify it, we collapse it. The thing that I was thinking about while you were speaking, though, Daniel, is that, so you ever had like this incredible experience with someone, or you have an experience of the real, and then you basically introduce it to language and you collapse it again. So it's like this horrible thing or this amazing thing. The amazing thing, we've all had the experience. You're like sitting with someone, you're like, this is amazing. And then you actually say, this is amazing. And then the fucking energy falls out from underneath you and it just becomes a regular moment. You're like, I shouldn't have said anything, and because the language kills that indeterminacy, that awe, that intercategorical moment, that sudden lift, right? So when you're saying, like, does the real just run rampant over the symbolic? No. Right. But what the symbolic does to the real is essentially suppress it. So it pushes it back into the unconscious. Now, if we haven't allowed the real to be present long enough and to like really feel our feelings in front of the real and get real with the real, and we apply language to it prematurely, it ends up regressing into the unconscious in a very sort of like volcanic state. But I would say that it's always volcanic. And this addresses, Dimitri's criticism. Underneath every single object we're interacting with, and I've been like meditating on like, what's it like to just see a chair? Like, oh, I see a chair. The reality is my actual experience with the chair is it's a confrontation. It's a momentary confrontation on like, what is that otherness? And I mentioned this in the presentation that you saw. First thing you see, like in my experience, first thing I see, and I think this relates to Hegel and Lacan and everything, is an otherness. And then we schematize it. And we're like, okay, no, that's a chair just like every other chair I've seen. And I suddenly absent it via the excess of repetition of chair. I'm like, no, that's chair. That's the thing I already know. And I push it back, I push it away. But the reality is every time I see anything, I'm actually being confronted that is in excess momentarily, briefly momentarily. And so throughout the day, it's like little blips of real. And then language comes in to just keep assuaging the terror, just like constantly assuaging to the shovel. No, shovel. No, that's just a shovel. And everything is this otherness that we turn into a sameness by acquiring it, and schematizing it, and placing it into, ironically, the real that we contain in our unconscious, which just sits there. And of course, that's why we're mortified of our unconscious. Anyway, I just want to say that language, or that the symbolic order has this overpowering effect on the real, where it's able to collapse it, schematize it, place it behind bars or under a cloak, or behind to use Zizek's analogy, behind a curtain. But it's always there behind the fucking curtain, or it is the curtain. Right? It's just curtain. And so we're able to subjugate it, but in subjugating it, it terrorizes us. So yeah.
No, you know, a few things. Javier, good to see you again. It's always interesting because I agree with everything you said. Like when you look at the triangle, if you will, of Lacan, you have imaginary, symbolic, and real. It looks like 3 different stages, and you could be in one and not the other. It's almost like you need to take it and turn it, and it's like a line where they're all constantly on the same, they're all in operation. They're all in operation at the same time. It's just interesting how visually seeing it, like words on a page, which makes me think of the violence of thought that Javier was talking about, makes it seem like different stages that you can be in one and not the other at the same time, when really it's more like they're all effusing one another in different things. And yeah, it would seem to me that without the real, you couldn't have the symbolic, right? Because I'm like, does a platypus have a imaginary, symbolic, and a real register, right? We would assume not. Maybe platypuses do. I don't have a pet one. Maybe y'all know something I don't. But there's something about how by gaining the excess of intellect or the excess of consciousness or the excess of the subject, you gain with that the problem of these registers that you then have to work and manage together, right? Where if you were a platypus, you may not. So it's interesting to think that in gaining something, you also gain this, that then the question is, how do you operate and manage those and operate with those things? And I think you're right that they're kind of infusing one another. The other wordplay, I was kind of, well, to me, this gets into like a massive challenge because like, you know, Cadell and I were talking about this. So when you have a relationship, like there's always you're always afraid to talk about the implicit background of the relationship and make it explicit because that could kill the relationship, right? And yet you also see that people who can't do that end up in trouble. So there's this ability to make the implicit explicit without killing it. That seems to be like the meta, that's like the major skill. Can you talk about Lacan's The Real without destroying everything, right? Like, can you talk about the it's almost like, I kind of wonder if today with AI in this age of history, if this is a particular historic epoch, if you grant me this language, where the ability to make the implicit explicit without killing the implicit is like the skill you must develop. Because everything is now known. AI, internet, everything is like known. So the implicit is being made explicit, but we need the implicit. And so how can we talk about it without killing it? Because exactly what you're saying, Mr. Ebert, like throughout history, you kill it. Like, and talking about it kills it. And this seems to be the new, you know, if I'm thinking concept, like this seems to be the challenge that the subject needs to be able to do. And it seems to be really, really hard. Also, as a funny wordplay, you mentioned awful and all some. It's kind of interesting to think that the awful is a hyphen full, like it's like too much all, and all some, S-O-M-E, like as some, all some. Like if we engage with the all full, it could be awful, but if we engage with the all some, we can handle it, but you only get some of it. And what's funny, if you get some all, don't you lose it? So like all sum with as S-O-M-E versus S-U-M, which would mean total, is interesting because like that's where you could experience it, but then it loses the all in becoming a sum, S-O-M-E, right? Whereas if you take on the all as full, the full all, the risk is that Lovecraft overwhelms you and you can't comprehend it and you're reduced, but you get all the all. Like if you get all the all in all full, but if you get all the all, it might destroy you basically. But if you get the all some, you get the all, but you only get some of it. So you lose some of the all. So I was thinking about that kind of play on the word based on what you were saying. And maybe that's the language. But please, Mr. Ebert.
No, I was just going to add to that the difference. This is what I wanted to mention between the difference between the awesome and awful experience. And this is good. This goes back to some work by this guy Keltner and Jonathan Haidt, who have been doing some work on awe and also to predictive mind. But basically, the difference may be, and I'm extrapolating, that the awful experience, or the awful, I feel like is just full of awe, but the awful experience is that which the subject is attempting to schematize and cannot. And the awesome experience is the experience where you're just allowing it to be unschematized, where you're just sort of, you're basking in the indeterminacy. But the awful experience is when you're like, what is this? What is like, and you can't find a fucking place for this experience. And so it turns into trauma. Actually, the word they used was that's what trauma does, where you can't find a place for it. Anyhow, but yeah, I think that the awesome, awful language is brilliant. I like awesome, S-U-M. That's a good one. Yeah.
Well, maybe it's all some SUM versus all some SOME, where you have those kind of two. Because it's so interesting because like if we take the idea of God in Western thought, God can kill you. Like if you see God in your Moses, you die, but also it's the beatific vision and point of life. And I'm wondering too with AI, like this is the problem, right? Like if we don't try to capture AI and contain all of it, which would destroy us, then we can enjoy some of it and be in all of some of it. But then if we let it go and be at some SUM, there's a threat that it kills us all, right? Like everyone's talking on Lex Friedman and all that. So there's this risk that has to be taken for us to be in all of some of it, which requires the ability of to AI to be the sum of it. But then that runs the risk of it taking over and all those different things, which there's something there that I wonder, and then I'll give it to you, Javier, because I know you miss, height and different things. There's something there that every phenomenon is like that in a way. There's like a replication of how that problem we're seeing with AI actually kind of speaks to a daily problem you have in any relationship. If you let the person be the fullness of themselves, you might be overwhelmed. It's like, oh, I don't want to know about that. I just want to know some of you, SOME, so that I can enjoy some of you, SOME. Don't give me all of you, because that would be awful. And the same with like AI. There's some kind of overlay there I'm interested in. But Javier, please, I'm glad you got out of your class.
Thanks. So one, I have a really quick anecdote that Ebert reminded me of. Me and my buddy really like playing the VR game Beat Saber. I actually think Beat Saber is a really good phenomenological case for AB when you start playing like expert mode, because what ends up happening is they switch the colors on you. It starts going cross-eyed. And then you start realizing how hard it is to teach your body to start reacting to those contradictory lanes of switching like all the time. And it's funny because me and my buddy were talking about this. He's like, the more that I want to have a perfect score, that's when I'm about to lose a note. It's like at that moment I'm about to lose a note. And it's so funny because he was telling me about his like neurotic urge to briefly glance at his combo number. Like he's like, I really want to look, but I know if I look, that's exactly when I fuck up. Like that's it, it's over. And he's like, he was asking me, he was like, I was like, I got a perfect song. He's like, how'd you do it? And I was like, so there's this one point where I forgot about it, but then there was a point where I started realizing and I started panicking. And then I said, and then as I kept like slashing, I said, I don't care, 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 I don't care. And I kept saying to myself, I don't fucking care, I don't care if I miss a note, I don't care. And then before you know it, the song's over. I didn't miss a note, right? But it was this absolute constant anxiety-inducing kind of like thing. Like the more that I wanted it, I knew I was about to mess up. But like I had to keep telling myself, like, you know what, I just don't care. Like, and then finally I was able to do it. But so in a more to go on to like the same topic, but as another kind of philosophical perspective from Kierkegaard, it reminded me of the awesome Awful, where he talks about how anxiety seems to root between this tension, at least for Kierkegaard, between time and eternity. But we can place this in the context that we're talking from, but the tension between awesome and awful. And it's funny because I would say awesome, at least the way I've been understanding anxiety recently, is that it's a simultaneous defense mechanism and a yearning to go past it. And I think that's the tension that you find yourself in. So I almost want to say that actually what is awesome is actually a defense mechanism, simultaneously blocking off the awful. And yet at the same time, there must be this ironic thing where we actually want to encounter the awful, which would be the most, at least it sounds ridiculous coming from out of my mouth for sure, but it has to be the most ironic thing for me, because it's like awesome must be this case of just like, you only grabbed whatever part of it. But if you grabbed all of it, you'd be like, oh, this is not cool anymore, man. So instantly I'm reminded of like when people like take too many drugs or whatever, like everything is going good, and then all of a sudden something happens, like, whoa, I'm not having a good time anymore. But yeah, I think there's something to that simultaneity of like a defense and then also a yearning for that over I don't have the word for it, but that yearning towards the awful.
That's really interesting. And let me give it to Cheetah. And you took me back to the days of putt-putt on the DDR machine. And there was this one time where I was on super X mode at super speed. And I got to like the very end with a perfect score. And the people started gathering around. They're like, ah! I was like, don't think about it. Don't think about it. Oh my gosh. That's actually fascinating to think about anxiety as wanting perfection. But know if you think about perfection, you'll lose it. Or anxiety to be like knowing you want all, but knowing that if you get too much all, it will destabilize you. Or anxiety being like, I want the real, but I know if I get the real, it will destroy me. Or if I think about getting the real, I'll back up. There's this double move occurring there that's pretty fascinating. And perhaps anxiety as a philosophical emotion has a whole lot to do with the idea that if you gain, you know that if you reach total saturation and excess, to use Mr. Ebert's language, then it's nothing. It's a new equilibrium. And it's like, I don't care if it's a new equilibrium. I don't care. And you accept it. But then there's also a nervous, like, don't screw up, get there. But then like, oh wait, don't think about it, because if you think about it, you're screw up. But I also need to think about it to get there. So what am I doing right now? Like, it's almost like in the DDR machine. And when you do, it's like when you're like, what exactly how is my body working if I'm literally saying I don't care and yet I'm still managing to act like I care? There's a break between the brain and the body. That weirdness seems to have a lot to do with anxiety and some sort of revelation, if you will, there. Maybe that's AI. Maybe AI grows you. I don't care. And you let it like erupt, right? You're like, I don't care. But like thinking about it, that's interesting to place anxiety in that experience. And forever I will now see you weeping like a girl. As you like, not that there's anything wrong with girls, Michelle, weeping like Grace, weeping like me. You know, I will forever see you weeping, going, I don't care. That image is with me forever. So thank you. Let me pass it.
Go ahead.
Because you said weeping like a girl, I had this. I've been just slowly, because I'm so hesitant to think about sexual difference, because like I'm such an artist that like I just but seriously, like when you're in the zone of creating, like when you're in the indeterminacy of creation, you're not like I'm not like a boy. I don't feel like a man. It's not like I'm a man creating a song as a man. Like that's not how I roll. It doesn't feel that way. So it's not how I identify. But I was thinking about, this idea that women are more emotional. Well, maybe actually they just have they have smaller limitations for their emotion. So they reach an excess state of excess emotion and then burst, like a cloud burst, when it has excess moisture. And they just burst earlier. It's not that they're more emotional, it's that they have a smaller limitation around their emotional capacity is less, which is interesting because it might mean that we're actually more emotional in the sense that we contain more emotion. So there's an interesting potential for reversal there.
No, I would note too, like you're saying about not thinking yourself. Like there's something like I mentioned self-forgetfulness. Javier and I would talk about self-forgetfulness, where that's not where you like demean yourself. You just forget about yourself as you use yourself in like an ultra saturation point, to use your language. There's almost something like in gender, when you're fully your gender, you forget the gender. There's like gender forgetfulness as well. And then of course, what would be interesting there is precisely the limitation then in the female example would be why people experience emotions and life has emotion. Like without those limitations, no one expressing emotion and everything would be like gray and dead, right? So it's interesting, like again, it's interesting to think that limitation is not what we think it is in the sense, like limitation is precisely the point where it pours out, like the waterfall. Like the limitation is where the water then pours and showers, right? Like the limitation is the point where the cloud starts to rain, where if it didn't, everything would die because there's no rain. So it's interesting to think of that function. And then that makes me think of like Javier and I were talking about like philosophical gradation, where everything is kind of running into one another. And the limit is just the point where the color becomes the other color. And there's a kind of philosophical gradation that occurs. So likewise, there's a point where the emotion then becomes expressed, and therefore something in the world to give the life color. But let me give it to Mr. Chitan.
But Lindsay over here is literally about to throw up her smoothie.
That is the funniest thing I've ever
because I suggested that it's possible that the limit that she has a more restricted limitation with regard to emotional capacity, and that it's at that breaking point that she's and that well, anyway, yeah, she's like, no, the fact that I can emote means I have more capacity for like the externalization of emotion not being a break in limit, but being or the acquiring of a new limit, or the pushing of a limitation, or the accessing of one limitation and then the meeting of another one, which is the ability to just externalize emotion, which that externalization reaches its own limit too. Like if you do Osho exercises, like how do you get rid of sadness? Well, you become more sad and more sad, cry more and more, and then you reach this excess point and sadness turns into laughter or whatever. So maybe, but anyway, yeah, she was about to throw up her milkshake with laughter, thinking that I could possibly be onto something here.
Will you tell Miss Lindsay that we made the point that without that limitation, there would be a no emotion in the world and life would be gray and dead, and like something out of the Wrinkle in Time book or something like that. But it is extremely interesting to think like men are limited in their ability to externalize emotion, right? And this is where it's like the lack and the excess immediately turn into another, right? Like it's always a gradation in like a sunset we were talking about, that the moment you say, oh, the internal hits the limit of the outside, there's a new thing that actually they're exercising more capacity in versus the male.
But then when you use the language that men are limited in their ability to express emotion, you've reneged on the expression of limit as the spigot or the waterfall.
That's a problem. It's always one-sided. Yeah.
So what if we were continuing in the vein we're talking about, we'd be like, men have a larger limitation. What do you call it? The more boundary surface to the interior of the limitation, theoretically. Or we're just, I don't know. It's an interesting problem to think through, and linguistically too, it's problematic. But I think it's worth it.
Well, the problem is, like, it's like Javier was saying on sublation and language. It's like what we're basically talking about is some kind of unlimit with the UN in parentheses. Like everyone has some kind of unlimit where the hitting of the limit is the unveiling of the unlimit, which falls into a new limit and an unlimit, but we don't have a word for that. Like this is where Lacan makes such good points that the entire trinity that he's describing is linguistically based, because even like when we think, like, so for example, when we think we're encountering the real to talk about the limitation of emotion regarding genders, like, oh, that's encountering the real. But even that is situated within the linguistical structure where you lack a term for unlimited in parentheses, right? Like there's like a linguistical situating of what believes to be the uncovering of the real, right? That actually in of itself has to then be resituated within a new way of thinking about it. Like you're saying, like there's a saturation of a limit that then unveils something else. So you keep falling into this problem.
What's a good word for, maybe you guys could help, like, what's a good word for this interior workspace that is pre-limit? Like, is there a good word for that?
Like, for me, it's theme.
Yeah.
Theme. Like it is the preliminary condition that
joy comes out of.
I mean, yeah, Chitan, you go ahead.
So I think Javier's point was very interesting there. When he was trying to relate this thinking between perfection and anxiety in that sense, and what is the relationship between them. And that's an interesting question to ask. And he sort of ended up with this problem of the yearning for, the awful, and how do we, and there's a word for it in the Lacanian vocabulary. It's called jouissance in some senses. This idea that there is a form of pleasure which sort of completely makes this this distinction between negative and positive emotions becomes ambiguous at that point. There's a point where pleasure and enjoyment become contrary to each other. You can enjoy something which is not giving you pleasure in the sense that your partial drive directly gets hooked onto the dead drive. When that is where you start enjoying your own negative emotions in that manner. And when you're saying something to be awful, awfulness actually has this dimension of this relationship with the dead drive, where your drives are not so directed towards your instincts, towards your desire, and so on and so forth. They are directly getting hooked onto the dead drive. That's what you mean by saying that real, when you get too close to real, when you sort of short circuit this dimension of language and symbolicization and you directly confront it, it becomes terrifying, it becomes it becomes horror, it becomes but what we miss is that in that awful there is a form of enjoyment also. There is a form of yearning, as sort of that we are never completely satisfied with only the awesome. In some senses, we do find certain forms of satisfaction with the awful, which cannot be compensated by, and then the question becomes, what are the ethics of this kind of relationship that we share with the awful in that manner. And I'm not and to sort of take this further, when we start thinking about this relationship in real and language from this context, and Ebert's earlier example being, that what would limitlessness mean? Limitlessness actually mean a point where you don't have any friction to walk. Limits give you the friction to walk. Without limits, you'll fall. It's like walking on a slippery floor. You'll keep on falling down. That's what will happen. You will not be able to cognize anything because you don't have the necessary force to walk on that, ground in that sense. So when we start thinking about language, and at what point language itself becomes slippery, because language essentially is not simply external to the real. Real is structured like a language. Language comes from real's own ability to map onto itself. There is something of that nature that exists in that sense, which is why we say the subject is the point of gap and so on and so forth. So one of the interesting questions that sort of starts to think about is, at what point real itself becomes or is unable to use its own linguistic repertoire to find some kind of determinacy in that sense, and what are the conditions at which that happens, and what are its relationship to enjoyment and drives and anxiety, as Javier said.
No, and I'll give it to Luba. I mean, there's this weird thing where if a thing is nothing without limit, then to talk about, it's funny how we react to the word limit, right? Oh, they're limited. No. But yet, if a thing doesn't have definition or existence without limit, well, then to say that men could have a more internal capacity for emotion could be to say that for men, emotion is more like nothing, right? That's the funny thing. It's like what we're exploring here is, like limit means definition, and limit means the ability to define, to experience, and yet definition is always incomplete. The moment I say that a cat is a four-legged animal with fur, I've like left out everything, and yet we would consider that potentially an adequate definition. So there's this, and then the question becomes, what happened when the real cannot define itself? Like, is there things that could make the real indefinable? I guess that's trauma. You brought that up, right? In different things. Anyway, let me give it to Mr. Luber.
I think there is a language of the real, to speak on what Chitan was saying. I think like Ebert, I feel what you're saying. Like, I feel like I'm an artist myself, and like I don't conform to the traditional like American notions of man, or like what is even man. Like to me, it's not something that to me it has to do with authenticity, just trying to striving for authenticity, and the strive and ultimately failure in the striving is the language of the real. It's the relational aspect of how we're actually able to strive and how we're able to comprehend the fail. in the striving. So like Daniel, just so you know how I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking literally in terms of like the real being disclosed through bounds and distance, like how a situation, I'm understanding a current situation, and then what is part of that understanding that's not yet revealed to me. The part that's not revealed to me, like, might not be a horror movie per se. It could be like it could be so funny to me that it can be tragic in the sense that I can't find humor in other things because it's that funny. It's like the reveal is just so funny. It changes how I view comedy, and it makes me not laugh at things as much now. Like it's just to me it's just like this it's hard. I'm painting right now at work, so it's very hard for me to multitask a little bit. So I keep forgetting what I have to say. But Javier, your comment about passion and the awfulness, what would you say? What striving mechanism or word or sentiment would be striving for awesomeness if it's not passion? Because to me, when I think of passion, I think of something that kind of frequently changes. Like my passion like hops around. So it's not something that like can be contained in a full sense, because it constantly there's like an exchange of passions that are constantly happening. I'm not really sure, but go ahead.
I'm going to say you're in excess because you're painting and talking at the same. So what's happening is the apathetic nothing that's full of possibility due to excess, Mr. Luber. So thank you for being an example of what we're talking about. That's really, really good. And Javier, please.
Yeah, Andrew, that's a good question. So I was actually going to bring this up already, but one of the things that I kind of distinguish with passion is like passion is not concerned with possessing. You are a being that is possessed, so to speak. So for example, I really liked when Ebert said this, like, what's the word? What's the word for like this thing? Like for me, that's already like the jouissance, the awfulness coming out when we don't even have a freaking word for what we're trying to designate. And yet you can tell that we're already possessed by this idea, like there must be a word. And there's also simultaneously a kind of enjoyment for trying to find this word. But the moment that we find a word for it, that's when it just becomes awesome. Like we're like, yes, awesome. We got a word. But eventually we're gonna hit the same marker where we're like, there's just gotta be this word. But to answer you, Andrew, yeah, I typically look at it like it's hard to say what is driving it, because I look at passion in the more historical like version of it as like there's a semblance of suffering, but it's in a state of like you are possessed, like you have to engender something. At least this is my own experience with passion. Like you have to engender something. The content, so much of it is not a concern to me. You can be passionate about different things and that can always change. But it's more about this state of possession that you're not really concerned about possessing something because you are possessed. The real question I would like to ask is it possible that the real can possess you rather than us trying to possess the real, rather than us trying to meet the real? Is there a kind of situation when that occurs? Of course, I'm still getting familiar with Lacan's language, so I don't even know if that's even a correct question. So, but yeah.
Let me give it to Mr. Ebert. Don't worry, we're all trying to get familiar with Lacan's language. So worry not, Javier. Mr. Ebert, please.
Oh, I say that the real can definitely possess you in those moments of the zone or whatever it is. Like whenever language or symbology absents, whenever you're in a state that resists symbolization, you're in the real. So if you're in a moment where it's like, there's no words, that's a moment of the real, And if you're in a constant state, like and it's interesting. You can still use language, right? Because the presence, the whole point of the mind is to have sent language into the unconscious so it can operate automatically. If you're operating, I mean, this is an interesting and highly problematic statement, but if you're operating like an automaton, and if you can be in the zone using language with no sense of anything, like what anything you are saying means, you just know it feels right. Everything's like, this is right. And yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. It's easier in sports, I think, these moments when you're actually not using language, but I think it's worth looking into, like, can yet language symbolization be used within the real? I was going to say a couple of things. One quick story. When I was touring my first Man, I'm a Robot, and I was at this place, and I'm from California, and we're in England for the first time, and I asked this like very gruff sound hand. I was like, "Hey, could you get another cable for the microphone?" And he's like, "Yeah." And I go, "Awesome." And he goes, "Awesome. This is awesome. That's awesome. Bloody hell." And he's making fun of my overuse of the word awesome, right? And so I'm thinking about what Javier is saying in terms of, like, awesome is this sort of sum of awe, S-O-M-E, sum of awe. But if you were really take the full awesomeness of anything, it would just fucking obliterate you, and it'd be awful. And it's a really galling statement, a very, very dark philosophy sort of statement, and I like it. It challenges me to, I started racking my brain for, like, have I experienced anything that would contradict that? Blah blah blah. I think I have, but I do like the idea of that as a provocation. It's like, if you are experiencing something with, the jouissance of something, have you just not gone far enough? Like, if there's any enjoyment, have you just not gone far enough? And I don't know. I mean, for me, I think that I would hold on to a number of experiences I've actually had and be like, no, you can experience the full onslaught of wonder, and that is what it is. The world is also beautiful, or nothingness is also satisfying. It's got a lot to, and back to Chiton and everything. It's like the death drive drives us at jouissance, drives us at those limit experiences, which is what Bataille calls them. And someone before him whose name is escaping me, but Karl, I think Popper maybe. But anyway, so you have this drive toward these limit experiences, and the last thing I was going to say is that, and those limit experiences absent the subject, which is something Foucault was also, like, following Bataille on. Last thing I was going to say was, for Lacan, anxiety is actually very apropos of this conversation. Anxiety is the inability to know what someone else is thinking about you. And one of the reasons you can't know what someone else is thinking about you, obviously, is limitations. But to my mind, it goes further than that. One of the reasons you don't one of the reasons you don't know what someone is thinking about you is because inside of their own unconscious, they're also indeterminate. So, like, they might think one thing about you explicitly, but you have no idea what's going on inside their black box. And they have no idea what's going on inside your black box. You're just two black boxes looking at each other. And that's his notion, in my own words and extrapolation, of anxiety. And it's an interesting definition of anxiety that I've written about, and actually I think I disagree with, but I can't remember. But it's a compelling idea.
It's very funny, and then let me give it to Luber. It's funny to think they're like, oh, I wonder what's going on in another person's head. I wonder what they're thinking. And if you were to actually get in their other head, they'd be like, I have no idea what I'm thinking right now. And it's funny how we assume that if we could get there, we could get truth, but you would just find another black box just like yourself. And that's interesting. The very fact that we tend to convince ourselves that's not the case would suggest some sort of myth maybe we tell ourselves for some particular reason, like the reliability of objectivity, like, oh, I could know myself if only I could know what other people thought of me. But you would jump in their head and they'd be like, I have no idea about that Daniel guy, and you're like, shoot. So
yeah, it's also got to that point, it also has to do with the petite object. I mean, it's a weird variant of that, but it's like, oh, I really want that person, now I have them and I realize they're full of nothing.
Yeah.
Like that's why I have nothing. That's why they're empty, because they're in their own saturated excess, and they're absent. And so I have this absent thing, and I guess I got to go find the other one. You know what I mean? So you could keep dialing the thing, this idea all the way through all the Lacanian stuff in a lot of ways. Anyway.
Quickly get in there, anxiety is not that, you want something from me and I can't give it to you. Anxiety is I don't know what you want from me. There's a double twist there.
Right. But you don't know what's going on with their desires, what they're driving.
Yeah, the other person's desire itself is screened off in some senses.
So would you say the way that I said it then is incorrect? A desire or anxiety for Lacan is that you don't know what the other person's thinking. It's more specific that you don't know what they want from you.
Yeah, there's a structural desire in that idea of thinking that you're raising. Basically, I'm not saying it's not like wrong or right in that sense, but there is a structure of desire which is located through which the thinking gets screened off in that language. There's something at stake in that question of desire there, that others' desire itself becomes inaccessible to you in that sense.
Yeah, I like that framing because it presupposes the want aspect. You already are in a desiring state because you're curious about what they're asking for, essentially. I like whenever in my high school, there was a lot of close groups of friends, and people would talk shit, and you would always hear about it, and a lot of people would get anxiety about what other people think based off of hearing what others have told them from the talking shit. And I used to always say, you really don't know why they're actually saying it. They could just be bored and gravitating toward something that is just salient and lowbrow or whatever, that is just easy to talk to because it's very comforting to be able to talk about something where someone's able to share in the conversation. And if it's something that's very easy to throw at, that's the easiest way to have one of those conversations. So I just think a lot of people, when they talk shit, it's an anxiety mechanism because they're actually so fucking bored that they don't actually have substance to talk about with other people. And I forget who said it, but I think it was one of the first ladies of the United States, but it's smart people talk about ideas and dumb people talk about other people or something like that. I think that's kind of what she was getting at with what I was saying. But I remember what I was going to say a couple minutes ago. The limit, there's always a limit present, but where that limit is located, where it's located, in relation to the male-female emotion conversation, and you can easily interpret the limit being somewhere else, where it's they're at the limit and operating at that limit of emotion capability, and that we males aren't attuned enough to the environment to actually be at the limit. So they're just not satisfied with our lack of being close to the limit like they are. So what I do find interesting is what's part of storytelling is where you're defining that limit, and where you place that limit in the schema or in the landscape in the conversation. And I feel I haven't really read Hegel at all, but I feel this is Hegelian in the sense, from what I hear, that where you define that limit kind of reflects about who you are as a person. So like every definition that you describe in return defines something that you weren't consciously thinking of in that moment. And it kind of reveals an aspect of you because your mind is now focused on something that wasn't initially at hand.
Right. You don't define the limit, but you discover. It's a process of discovery through quantitative excess or relational excess, or infinite self-relation is the moment at which that liminal moment happens, where the limit is discovered. And yeah, we don't, and I like what you're saying, that like men just might not have attunement to fill the interior up to the limit, and women are more attuned, and so they're filling that limit. Maybe we have the same limits, men are just duller. But yeah.
Well, what's interesting, and then I'll pass it to Javier, it's almost like you could say we are not limited in locating our limits, but we are limited in having to locate limit. And then that limit is a result, like we're also like limited from never having an excess point. Like there's always a point of total relation. So you're limited from not ever having a point of total relation. Because it's interesting, like the point of total relation to Mr. Ebert's work would be precisely the point where you're limited from any more saturation per se. So that's what's weird. It's precisely the moment of total relation unveils an inability to saturate anymore. And that seems to be like, then of course, I guess the anxiety is why this point and not another point. Like when you ask, like, why is reality a point that this was the point of the total relation and not another moment of saturation? Like, why did the limit appear here? And why did the limit appear here in a manner that would lead you to the next threshold, right? You could have anxiety because then you're like, should I go with it? Should I go with the transition or not? There are different anxieties that might emerge there. And then, because then it's like, how does it reflect on you if you have to totally relate at this point of emotion, if we use that example, versus another point of emotion? And do you go with that? Do you accept that or not? And then, going with the flow or not? But let me give it to Javier here.
So I always like, I've been hopefully I can do this eventually where I can tie in Kierkegaard and Lacan together, because I think it would be really interesting. Because actually Kierkegaard, the issue for Kierkegaard in some anxieties is comparison, right? The other is the problem. But it's funny, from the subjective point of view, when somebody's giving you advice, whatever they're saying, you're thinking, oh, they're saying that they're better than me. So there's this like interpretive overlap where you're like, own consciousness is like blocking whatever is being said, because you're like, oh, all this advice you're giving me, you're just saying that you're better than me. That's how I interpret it. I need to be like you. So I've been thinking about how I would like to situate Kierkegaard and Lacan together, but of course I'm still obviously always going to be reading Lacan. But to this question of the real, I'm wondering, or we could talk about the limit actually. I'm wondering if the issue is because we don't find a real relation to the real. Kierkegaard talks about you need to have a relation to the subjective truth itself, because if you don't have a relation, then you just become like a kind of like nihilate. We talked about this, Daniel, where you like basically you've discovered the truth, but you have no relation to it. So it's like everything's pointless, right? So it's like this dramatic, tragic, everything's pointless. You have no real relation to the truth, and that's what Kierkegaard is critiquing. So I'm curious if the problem with limits is because we're not actually having a real relation with limits. And I'd be curious to see like how that actually looks like. The only thing that I can say for myself, my own experience, is like, because I'm in school now, it's fucking driving me crazy that I can't do my own writing, right? Every time I'm working, and then all of a sudden I'm like, cool, I'm going to get to it. And then I realize I can't get to it. I'm too tired. But then I've been doing this move where I'm like, fuck it. I'm going to do that stuff first, right? I'm going to write what I want to write first, what I want to do first. And then I end up having like a cathartic releasement where I literally just don't care what happens the rest of the day. Whatever happens, I just don't care. So it's almost like I'm having this relation where it's like, you know what? If work calls me and says, hey, I got to work in an hour, then I'm going to do it. Like it doesn't matter anymore. So for me, it's very similar to that experience with like Beat Saber that I was talking about, where it's like the more and more that I want it, the farther I get away from it. But the more I start situating myself where I'm like, you know what? I already have my relation to it. I have my relation to it. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. And I feel like that kind of helps you deal with the limit. And then you realize that you've surpassed the limit by the retroactive kind of looking back. But I'd be curious. Yeah, I'd just be curious how that kind of sounds to everybody else.
No, I think it's I think it's fascinating, and I fear I'll have to go in about 10 or so minutes. Chad, I feel like we're trying to talk about different kind of ineffabilities. Like there are different ineffabilities. How do you talk about different ineffabilities? And there's some sort of weirdness going on there. I also find it extremely weird that having an afternoon when you have nothing to do, you're not as productive versus when you have a deadline you're ignoring. Why is it having a limit that you ignore makes you more productive versus if you had the same time to do it, but you didn't have that limit to ignore? Just knowing there is some sort of deadline that you're ignoring makes you more motivated than if you didn't have that deadline. Why is that? Well, that it's almost like definition, limit. There's something there that fires up, but let me pass. Luke.
For me, how at least I interpret the real isn't something that is like terrible or a catastrophe in like the sense that it's like something bad is happening. I think it's just it's like the through line of the story. That's what's real. Like it's the underpinnings, and in that sense, it doesn't have to be something that destroys you. Like it only destroys you in the sense if you fully invest in the identity that you're approaching the real with. And in that sense, if your mental is focused on your relation to your identity, then you can't ever really be destroyed. Like, because you just understand how to relate to a possible different identity. Like, that's why, like, just pursuing the arts, I try to, everything that I do, everything that I try to identify with, I try to see how each identification relates and kind of overlaps with the other identifications. Because in that sense, it's like momentum. It's just like putting momentum on yourself because you're able to, let's say, as a filmmaker or a screenwriter, I fail. Well, that's fine. I still have like my philosophy. I still have other avenues. Like I have just storytelling. Like it doesn't necessarily mean that my identity as a filmmaker is everything that I am. It's just part of the Rolodex of relations that I contain at the moment.
Like the word real is always like in the same way that Javier and I have talked about, like the word lack puts a lot of emphasis on away from the excess that comes with that lack. Likewise, the word real becomes tricky because then, of course, your mind goes to like actual, like facts are different things. So there's tricky things because there is something like, can't you like choose your reality? Like in the sense of, no, the real is that I'm actually a screenwriter. If everyone thinks I suck at it, F them, right? Like, so there is some sort of locating of maybe what it is what's most important to you, right? And that's what, like, what do you think is most important? What do you most identify with? So there's some movement there. And then, of course, I guess you could say the development of the subject is the ability to move your identification to a place where it's not so dependent on what other people think and so on and so forth. But then, of course, you could be a Ayn Grandian, John Grohl jerk who doesn't really care about other people, right? So there's a ditch on all these other sides of the road and different things. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert.
I have one, I guess the one thing I'll say is that with regard to Javier, like a relation to our limits, trying to sort of process that. I feel like, I don't know, I'm constantly, like, I feel like I have a pretty good relationship to my limitations, and that especially artistically, a lot of what, accessing limitations is about not believing you're limited and being like, nah, fuck it, I can do it. And then it's interesting the way the way you do it is by reaching the capacity of your limitations, at which point a transformation or phase shifting occurs. And suddenly you become a master, but you don't become a master because your limitation was always at the outermost region of masterdom. You become a master because you've accessed your limitation of initiate, and saturated that initiate space, and then became this next thing, or that's the way I sort of process limit, and in that sense, I feel like I have a good and largely confrontational relationship with my limitations. I always want to access them, and that's part of why I've learned to love them. I never loved limitations before. If we were having this conversation 5 years ago, I'd be like, "Fuck you, I don't have limits." But that was always why I was accessing my limits all the time. It was like, I have no limitations, and but I didn't understand that the reason I was growing as a person is because I kept saturating these thresholds for any given paradigm I was in, and that those thresholds themselves were producing the sense of progress in my life.
Beautiful, Mr. Ebert. I'm afraid I just heard a giant bolt of thunder, so I might get cut off the call in a moment. There's something very interesting with that. So there's a few things. In the way of anxiety is this, what does the other person want from me? I wonder if like this existential anxiety is, what does the world want with me? What does existence want from me? And in the same way you were talking about the game, when you're doing the game, you're like, just keep going. It's like, what does this game want with me? What does it want with me? It wants you to be perfect. But I can't think about being perfect. So there's this way in which the game, in its very being a game, wants you to get the perfect score, right? That's the idea of the game. And yet you knowing that's what the game wants of you throws you mentally off from doing what the game wants of you, right? But then what do you mean it wants something of you? It's just a game. It doesn't want anything of you. Yes, it does. It does. And yet it doesn't. And there's something weird that occurs where the very experience of life and the world is you experience the world as wanting something of you, but it doesn't say anything. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't have language. It just has bookcases and cats and phenomenon, and it wants something of you. And you're like, well, maybe I'm just imposing that on myself. Maybe the game doesn't care if I get a perfect score or not, but it feels like it does care. And it feels like I should, because the board is situated in a way where you can accomplish that. And if you don't accomplish that, that means you missed one of the arrows, one of the things, so you failed, right? So there's something about the world. It's almost like the world presents itself saying there's something it wants of you, and that's to like world well or something, like to play the game well, to be in the world well. But then the question is, what is the metric of worlding, right? Well, it seems to have something of like taking as much world in as possible, or like being fully saturated by, like relating to it in a manner that doesn't miss out on it or that fully participates in it. But then the problem is, the more we fully participate in it, the more we're overwhelmed in our finitude and seem to be destroyed. So then you're like, wait a minute, does the world want me to enter into a mode that overwhelms me, that like destroys me? Well, that doesn't make any sense. But then it seems like the thing that destroys you is also the experience of all that's so wonderful. So then death and sex and birth and all these things are all mixed together, and the world seems to be something that says to you, you need to experience some kind of mixture of sex, death, and birth, and an experience of all that you and your finitude cannot fully handle. And you're like, well, that's a really effed up game. It's like, you're already in it. Have fun. It's like, oh gosh, I can't think about it, because then it's weird, because if you think about all that, how do you have sex, death, and birth all together? Well, it doesn't make any sense. Likewise, like, I don't know what I'm doing. Likewise, if you think about the girth, I got to get a perfect score, then you're overwhelmed, right? And so there's some weirdness about the very thinking of it that leads to how do I do it? And yet you need to know about it to do it, but then not think too much about it as you do it, or you get thrown off, right? There's something really weird going on here, and it has something to do with the way that the brain works, I guess. It's also interesting in what you're saying about limit. It's almost like every limit is a finish line. Like you think about limits as finish lines. And if you reach it, you finished, and every finish line is also a starting line. Like every finish line, every limit is actually a finish line / starting line. And so once you get there, once you reach, like you say, you reach that new equilibrium, and now you start something else. And it's like every limit is a line more so. And it's not the problem is the word limit sounds like wall. It's like a wall, right? But it's more like a finish line that's also a starting line. And yet we don't tend to think of, we don't metaphorically think about ending a race at the start of another race. right? But that seems to be kind of what's going on somehow, that every limit is actually a finish line that's simultaneously a starting line. And then we get pissed off at the world because we're like, what kind of game is this? It would be like Javier, as soon as you like got the perfect score, the game was like, congratulations, you go directly into another level. What? Like it keeps going, and like your perfect score is at risk because it just extends the map. It's like, congratulations, you unlocked the extension of the level, and you're like, this sucks because I thought I had a perfect score, and precisely because I got the perfect score, I unlocked the next part of the level that to keep my perfect score, I have to finish it perfectly again. And then if you finish it, there's another starting line of another one, and every perfection unlocks another level that you have to maintain perfection in to keep your perfection. So you're like, that's screwed up. But man, if you got through like 30 minutes of perfection, wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't that be amazing if you actually managed to be perfect for 30 minutes? And that's only possible if every level unlocks another level, right? So the cruelty of each level leading to another level is precisely the invitation to accomplish something awesome, to be even more awesome, because you can keep going. But the invitation to be more awesome comes with the cost of feeling like you're being screwed because the level keeps extending. Like you can only do something more awesome precisely because it won't close it out and give you your final score. So there's some weird dynamic at play there. But I fear with all of that, I will run because I'm afraid that the lightning will turn off the internet and I'll lose the recording. So I better not do that. I've enjoyed this. Thank you for staying. I've enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure. You guys are beautiful souls. Thank you, everyone. You are wonderful.